Hey, welcome back to Author Talk. I'm John Hartness, and this is the show where we talk about books with authors. And this is another piece of our Stuff Writers Get Wrong series. So I'm here with retiree A.J. Hartley, New York Times bestseller, PhD in, what the hell is your doctorate in anyway?
English.
English, okay. That fits because you are.
That's right. You get a PhD the moment you're born in England.
I mean,
It's
it
just
makes
the law.
sense. I mean, I should have a PhD in redneck.
I think we can arrange that.
It's got to be at least as difficult as me getting ordained as a minister, which took 5 minutes on the internet. But anyway, AJ's here to talk a little bit about some things that writers get wrong when they're doing historical research or things that they just get wrong about history, because the Middle Ages were not that clean, y'all. So tell the folks a little bit about what you used to do in your day job and why you know bupkis about history, other than, the fact that we're old.
So, well, as we have already established, my PhD is in English. I still am technically, because I have emeritus status, Shakespeare professor, the Robinson Distinguished Professor of Shakespeare at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, where I was for 18 years. I was in Georgia for 10 and in Boston before. So yeah, so I was trained as a historian, a textual historian, and then I became sort of more of a performance person, a stage history and performance theory person.
So my expression of shock was not for the fact that they put up with you for 18 years at UNCC. It was that you were there that long, because I knew your predecessor, Dennis Kay.
Yeah.
So thinking back, and I was like, oh yeah, we did that show together 23 years ago. So yeah. So what are things that writers get wrong when they're writing about history?
Well, one of the things which I heard you talking about a little bit earlier is that they go out of their way to constantly remind people that you're in a different period, which frequently is a form of info dumping, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, I have done some research and god damn it, you're going to read it.
Yeah, I get that.
It's like, I am walking down the street and I'm now going to bombard you with everything about this street that reminds you that it's not the street that you live in.
I'm actually working hard to avoid that right now, because I'm writing a Quincy Harker book set in Mantia, and I took a trip to Mantia for research, so now I've got to make sure that I don't just pour all of everything in there, and I only use it to drive the narrative.
And I think, it's fine to do that on your first draft.
Yeah.
And then put it aside for a little bit. And then when you come back to and then read it, and try to read it as if you were simply a reader rather than the person who created it, and you can tell when the story starts to lag, where it feels like we're getting a lot of wallpaper.
So do what Elmore Leonard told you to do. Figure out the parts that people are going to skip, and don't write those.
Yeah, and also write dialogue like Elmore Leonard. Then you go. The second, as a more sort of conventional writerly error, I think, is tech. And by tech, I mean any kind of, I'm using the word technology in its broadest sense.
Okay.
So that you get on a ship, and you say it's a medieval, 14th century ship, and you immediately think you know what that is.
Okay.
And then you start writing, and then you start getting the letters that say, well, this kind of ship that you're talking about didn't actually exist for 200 years until afterwards, right? And this compass, or this, propulsion system, or whatever, you're getting it wrong in certain respects, because that's where your research hasn't gone deep enough, frequently because you don't think you need to do it.
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? It's usually fine to research the stuff you don't know anything about. It's the stuff that you assume is kind of the same as now, or to a sort of generic historical period that you think you understand. That's where you make mistakes.
I think that's also the case when writing contemporary fiction, because I expect that that's what informs a lot of the errors people get when writing guns,
Right.
which is a whole different video coming soon.
But it's a good example of the kind of thing that if you get it wrong, you're going to hear about it.
Yeah.
Right? Because guns and
Horses.
horses and boats,
Oh yeah.
these are the
Both
things
people are
that people
just as
upset. Oh yeah, because it's
just
not
as
just it's not a
crazy.
hobby; it's a lifestyle
Yeah.
or a pathology, depending. Right. So
Yeah. I mean, for me, there's a book that I was quite enjoying until they got a scene so wrong where the characters were playing poker, and I was like, "It's poker, for God's sake! How do you screw it up that badly?"
Yeah. So those kind of things, I think, when you're doing any kind of research in a period, you have to know that you're getting it right. And then, as we were saying before, the trick is to then figure out what not to need to put in the actual book, or to put it there initially and then take it out again later on.
And a lot of
Always
that-
assume that anything in the past is different from what you think it is.
And don't assume that your editor's going to catch it, because your editor may not know that they don't know, and they are quite likely going to assume that you did your research.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was editing a novella where the author had something happen on a train, and it was a pretty convoluted series of events, and then the person on the train saw the lights of Memphis in the distance. I had to research whether in 1906 there were lights in Memphis that you could see from a distance, and then how far away you could see them, and whether or not you could do the rest of the action in the story in the time that you had.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know how fast a train went
Right.
at that time. I don't actually know how fast a train goes now.
Depends where you are. In America, it's very slow.
But the ones you just got off of on your
In Japan, very fast.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
so
So
let's do
that's-
one more.
Let's do one more. To me, this is the most interesting, but it's also the most complicated. The thing that most historical fiction writers get wrong is people. And by that I mean, let me come at it a different way. When you write historical fiction, you're always writing alternative history
Right.
and or fantasy.
Sure.
You're not actually writing history at all.
Well, no, because
And the more time you spend doing real history, real like scholarly work, you sort of come to that position where you recognize that people in history are totally not like us. They don't think like us, they don't function like us, they don't have the same attitudes to all the things that we would assume are constants throughout history, like food, for example. People don't think about food in the Renaissance in the same way that we do, because its availability and it's a totally different kind of construct.
even in America prior to the Depression, I remember talking to my father about the ways that that poor people in the South ate, and if you couldn't grow it or hunt it or raise it and kill it, you probably weren't eating it.
Well, I mean, even in my own past, that when I talk to people about, my first experience of going to Japan and being confronted with Japanese food in the 80s was quite sort of traumatic, because not just because I wasn't used to, I didn't have a very sort of cosmopolitan upbringing or something, but because what we ate was northern post-war rationing stuff, which lasted well after the Second World War and shaped the way people, canned spaghetti and stuff like that. That was standard for us, growing up.
Same for me. I grew up with Depression-era parents, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I figured out the reason my mother...
Not just depressing parents.
Right, not just depressing parents. But because my parents were born in 1929 and 1933, I was an adult before I realized that that's why my mother always cooked her meat until it had the consistency of a hockey puck.
Right.
Because she grew up in abject poverty and couldn't trust the meat.
Right.
So you cooked the hell out of it to make sure it wouldn't kill you.
Yeah, and your refrigeration options were limited at best, and so on. Yeah, yeah. So the larger point, I think, is really quite hard to get your head around, though, because as we're contextualizing our own past, you think the further back you go, how much harder that gets.
Yeah.
To sort of think, what does somebody in Shakespeare's England think about things? How do they think about themselves? How do they think about the big stuff like God and society and all those kind of things? Totally foreign to the way that we think.
I don't remember the book, which is awful because it was a book I quite enjoyed. But it was someone who, member of the ruling class, was talking to a peasant or serf and talking about concerns of the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And the person they were talking to had no idea that they were even in a kingdom.
Right, yeah.
They're
Yeah.
like, I plow my field
Yeah.
for my lord, baron, whatever, knew nothing,
Yeah.
wouldn't have recognized the king if they
Yeah.
walked up and
Right, exactly right. And that comes back to my tech thing, right?
Yeah.
At the beginning, right? That we tend to assume our own ease of communication, the way that news gets around and knowledge gets transmitted and such, and for the people, not that long ago, it just didn't happen. How long did it take for the Emancipation Proclamation to reach, parts of the U.S.?
is this the part where I say 200 plus years?
Well, right, yeah. But you know what I mean.
But yeah,
right?
it did, and even
And that was
looking
like
back
not
to
long ago.
even looking back to Dewey beats Truman. Well,
Right.
now we know before we go to bed most of the time
Yeah.
who's won in a given election,
Yeah.
even if it's around the world or
Right.
across the country.
Yeah.
But 50 years ago,
Yeah.
well, there was television, but
Yeah.
not everybody had it. Not everybody had cable.
But here's the paradox, and this is where it gets tricky, I think, because when I have read historical fiction that does the history really well, the story often really suffers. Right? You read something like Colin Willis's Doomsday Book, which is premised on the idea of a contemporary Oxford professor, and they have a time travel system. And this person is going back into the Middle Ages to study a village. And something goes wrong, and she finishes up arriving just after the plague has hit.
Well, that's a bad day.
Yeah. And it's a very long book, and it's basically watching her watch all the people around her die. And she can do almost nothing because she has no agency of any kind. She can barely communicate because no matter how much Anglo-Saxon she has studied, it doesn't really work because the dialect variances between small areas was so great. The misogyny, the power of the authorities and stuff completely squeezes her out. Nobody trusts her because they don't know her, because she hasn't grown. So it's fascinating because it means that your protagonist can do almost nothing except be your eyes while everything falls apart.
That sounds a lot like reading the Diary of Samuel Pepys or something like that.
Yeah, but it's worse, and this is made up. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and the problem, of course, is that in the end, when you're writing historical fiction, you're not writing it to be read by historical people, you're writing it to be read by your contemporary audience.
Right.
So if you genuinely are able to embrace the historical past, what you get is an alienation effect from your modern reader. So often the most successful historical fiction is not particularly good as history, because what it really is contemporary 21st century subjects dressed in funny clothes, occasionally saying slightly odd things, occasionally believing things that we don't believe anymore or whatever, but basically people who are the same as us. And that's why I'm saying you're always doing a form of fantasy, really.
Yeah.
It's not actually history at all.
And if you try to be completely period accurate, yeah, you're probably alienating a big chunk of your contemporary readers. And I hate to be the one to break it to you, but nobody in 1750 is buying your book.
Right. Yeah.
Because time may be wibbly wobbly, but we still get paid today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The past is another country, and you don't speak the language, and you don't know the customs, and you're wandering around without a map. And that might be interesting to a point, but it's really hard to sort of form a narrative that connects to the present, unless you sort of embrace the unreality of what you're doing and saying, okay, so yeah, it's going to be basically a Renaissance fair.
That might be the most unintentional segue I've ever seen anybody do, because a lot of times the present is like another country, or your protagonist has roots in multiple countries, like Hideki Smith, Demon Queller, your new release from Falstaff Books. But for now, we're going to call this Author Talk. So thanks for joining us, and until next time, bye.
Thank you.